So we're picking up today with industrialization in continental Europe and starting with national variations. So the process of Western industrialization proceeded gradually, and it was uneven, and there were certainly national and even regional variations. In 1750, the leading industrialized countries were fairly close together in their level of industrialization, with even Britain was only slightly ahead of France. But Britain opened up a noticeable lead over all other continental countries, or over all continental countries by 1800. And that gap continued to progressively widen as the British Industrial Revolution accelerated to 1830 and then reached full maturity by 1860. In Belgium, achieving independence from the Netherlands in 1831, they were rich in iron and coal. They experienced a truly revolutionary surge between 1830 and 1860 as well. Not like in Britain, but it was still impressive. France's relatively good pattern of early industrial growth was somewhat unjustly tarnished by the spectacular rise of Germany and the United States after 1860. And so Eastern and Southern Europe began the process of modern industrialization later, but really began to make progress by the late 19th century, so the end of the 1800s. European countries industrialized to a greater or lesser extent, even as most of the non-Western world was almost de-industrialized, which was a development that magnified existing inequalities between Europe and the rest of the world. So as Europe began to take off, there was a marked difference between Europe and the United States and the rest of the world. So by no means did the Industrial Revolution happen evenly across Europe. So the challenge of industrialization. The place of British industry began to accelerate in the 1780s, and continental businesses began to adopt the new methods as they proved how profitable they really were. And because there weren't really any wars fought on British soil in the early industrial period, Britain didn't really experience the physical destruction or the economic dislocation that the continent of Europe did. On the continent, by contrast, you've got upheavals starting with the French Revolution, which disrupted trade, created inflation, fostered social anxiety among the people. And so the widening gap in economic production made it more difficult, if not impossible, for other countries to follow the British pattern in energy and industry after peace was restored in 1815. British technology had become so advanced and complicated by this point that very few engineers or skilled technicians outside of England understood it. And the English were very protective over their technological inventions. Continental business people, or people living within the continent of Europe, the landmass of Europe, had great difficulty finding both large sums of money the new methods demanded, nor could they find enough laborers that were accustomed to working in factories. Most of the continental countries had a rich tradition of the cottage industry and the putting out enterprise, also merchant capitalists and skilled urban artisans, which gave them the ability to adapt and survive in the face of new market conditions. And in many cases, instead of developing new technology, continental capitalists were able to borrow the new methods developed in Great Britain, as well as engineers and some of the financial resources that these countries lacked. Countries with strong independent governments like France and Russia would eventually use the power of the state to promote industry and finally catch up with Great Britain. So who were the agents of industrialization? In Britain, they quickly realized the great value of their technical discoveries and made it illegal for artisans and skilled mechanics to leave Britain. Many of the talented and ambitious workers, however, were able to slip out of the country illegally and make a whole lot of money introducing these new methods elsewhere. For example, there was a man named William Cockerell and his sons who moved to Belgium and created a large industrial enterprise. And his plants continually gathered new information and transmitted it all across Europe. And in addition to British technicians and skilled workers being a powerful force in the spread of early industrialization, talented entrepreneurs and business pioneers in other countries pushed really hard to try to match England's achievements. So most continental businesses adopted factory technology slowly, and for the most part, the handicraft methods of artisans and craftsmen lived on for a while. Government support and corporate banking. Governments helped business people in continental countries overcome difficulties in their industrialization efforts using tariff protection and other measures. Tariff protection is when you put taxes on exports to encourage people to buy imports or the stuff that is created in their own country. And so after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, for example, France was flooded with cheaper and better British goods. And so the French government responded by putting high tariffs on British imports in order to protect the French economy. Continental governments bore part or all of the cost of building roads, canals, and railroads that would improve the transportation of these goods. Built rapidly as a unified network, Belgium's state-owned railroads stimulated the development of heavy industry and made the country an early industrial leader. In Prussia, the government guaranteed railroad bonds, which enabled private railroad companies to raise capital quickly from investors, and they faced little risk. In Germany, there was a journalist and an intellectual named Friedrich List, and I'll spell that for you, just List, Friedrich List, who considered the growth of modern industry of the utmost importance because he believed that it was this modern industry and manufacturing that was a primary means of increasing people's well-being and relieving their poverty. And in his influential work, National System of Political Economy, List supported not only railroad building and the tariff, but also the formation of a customs union, or a Zollverein, among the German states. So by the 1840s, List's economic nationalism, which was designed to protect and develop the national economy, had become really popular in Germany and even outside of Germany. And so banks, like governments, also played a large and creative role on the continent of Europe, even more so than in Britain. In the 1830s, two Belgian banks received permission from the growth-oriented government to establish themselves as corporations with limited liability. And so publicizing the risk-reducing advantage of limited liability for investors, these Belgian banks were attracting many shareholders, and they mobilized impressive resources for investment in big companies. And they became industrial banks and successfully promoted industrial development. So people were no longer afraid to invest tons of money because there was only limited liability. Instead of full liability, where if you invest and the company goes under, then you've lost all of your money. So similar corporate banks, usually working in collaboration with governments, became important in France and Germany as well. And so the combined efforts of skilled workers, entrepreneurs, governments, and even industrial banks came together to usher in this period of unprecedented economic growth on the continent of Europe. And in the early 1870s, Britain was still Europe's most industrial nation, but there were a handful of countries that were beginning to close the gap that was opened up by the Industrial Revolution.